In today's video, we're back with some updated NHL trade rumors, and we have a lot of teams we're taking a look at, including the Boston Bruins, New York Rangers, New York Islanders, San Jose Sharks, Tampa Bay Lightning, the Vancouver Canucks, as well as a few others. We'll get into all that coming up next. Now, welcome back here to Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have a lot to cover here today. There's plenty of NHL teams that are kind of uptight against the cap after getting through free agency and adding several new bodies to their lineup here, which will result in them shedding some salary and possibly having some cap casualties here within their existing roster. So what we might see here, let's get into it and get started with Vancouver. Now, one name that keeps coming up here a lot based on a variety of reasons, not only his play, but everything we've seen during the offseason with remarks that he made earlier, was Loui Eriksson of the Vancouver Canucks. One quick update here on him is just to say that basically it looks as though the Canucks are trying to play hardball with him a little bit to be flexible with his no trade clause, because they're kind of threatening to say that he could go down to the minors and play for Utica instead of playing on the main roster in Vancouver. Now, obviously, he's probably not going to want to do that. But at the same time, I'm not convinced that that's going to give them a ton of leverage for him to be flexible, because as much as he doesn't want to play in the minors, they really need the flexibility to move that contract with all the other contracts that they've done here during the offseason. They still got to sign Brock Besser, Nikolai Goldobin, and they're getting tight on space now. So obviously, that's really, they need to move the contract and get the full amount off. So obviously, if they demote him to the minors, he'd have to clear waivers. So there is a possibility he could be claimed, but it's pretty unlikely given his play and his contract that's attached to him. So obviously, if he does go over to the minors, though, they only get a minor relief of just over $1 million off the salary cap. The rest of it would still count. So that's not really going to get them all that far. It creates a roster spot, which is helpful, but at the same time, it's not really going to create the necessary salary cap space that they really need here. So obviously, I'm not sure how this is going to go. Both sides probably feel they have leverage here, and Jim Benning and the Canucks are going to continue to look for a trade. So the Canucks do need to make a move, and all the talk that we've heard about Eriksson maybe going to another team with a swap of bad contracts probably is unlikely to happen now, because now they're in a predicament with all the other players they've added that they need to free up the space. They can't just swap it for another similar type of contract. Like I said, we've heard talk about Eriksson for Lucic, Eriksson for James Neal, other contracts around the league that maybe could be swapped. But they're kind of in a predicament now, that especially where they brought in Michael Furlan, another $3.5 million against the cap, that pretty much is deals out the window. That can't really happen now. They need to find a way to shed salary, and there's really not a ton of other players making a lot of money that would really help with that regard. So I guess we'll see how creative Jim Benning can be here and how flexible they can work together to find Eriksson a new home for next season. Now, apparently the Tampa Bay Lightning have interest in right-shot defenseman Rasmus Ristolainen of the Buffalo Sabres. Now, we've talked about the Sabres a fair bit here recently. There's been a lot of talk around them with some of the other moves they made, that the right-shot defenseman likely would be available, especially if you can bring them a scoring forward, preferably a number 2 center iceman. And the Tampa Bay Lightning, with the loss of some of their D-men through free agency, obviously we saw Anton Stroman go to the Panthers. Dan Girardi's not coming back. There is some holes in that back end, which they can fill with youngsters if they decide to go that route. But I know even last year, near the trade deadline, there was some talk of even adding a right shot guy at that point, that they might want more experience for a deeper playoff run. So they very well could kind of test the waters. Obviously, the Lightning are still a really strong team, could go into the regular season here with more youth on the back end and maybe look to add a right shot D near the trade deadline. Again, that's a possibility that they might go that route here instead. But with the interest in Ristolainen, obviously there's a lot of forwards within the Lightning that certainly would be appealing to the Sabres, I think. The only problem is the Lightning have handed out way too many no trade clauses. In my opinion, the no trade clause, or even a modified no trade, should be limited to your absolute top players. And even though many of these guys are good players, I just think that the Lightning have handed them out way too freely here. But if you take a look at guys like Tyler Johnson, Alex Killorn, Andre Palat, even Yanni Gourde, they all have a form of a no-trade clause, some of them having full no moves, which certainly complicates including them in a trade. Now, probably Tyler Johnson would probably be the most attractive to the Sabres, where they want a center. But I mean, even the other guys I mentioned would be decent returns as well. They could probably move some guys around. A lot of forwards have played center at one point in time here. So obviously that's going to complicate things for Tampa. If the Lightning are going to end up making a move like that, they'd probably have to go down the route of trading a younger player, which they probably would prefer not to do. It'd likely have to be either Matthew Joseph, maybe Anthony Cirelli, or some of their other prospects that they have. The Lightning do still have a fair bit of prospects playing in their minor league system, as they have such a deep forward group already that cracking that lineup on a regular basis is certainly a bit of a challenge. So the Lightning do have interest in Ristolainen. I think they'd like to make that move, but they're kind of a little bit handcuffed here. Given the fact that these forwards are playing on a contending team, the state of Florida is very tax-friendly as well. I just don't see them being very flexible with their no-trade clause here. Obviously, they still have the Ryan Callahan contract as well, which can go on long-term injury reserve. I think the Lightning would still prefer to move the contract if they could, but I can't see the Sabres taking that along with some other prospects or something in return for Ristolainen. I mean, the Ristolainen trade rumors have certainly indicated that the Sabres were looking for a fair bit. They still feel like he's got a fair bit of value here, and I just don't see them making that kind of move. So even though there's interest from Tampa, just not sure they have the assets because of all the no-trade clauses really on their roster. The New York Rangers very well might end up going to salary arbitration here with Jacob Trouba, just like we've seen the Winnipeg Jets do here in the past. Obviously, the Rangers acquired Trouba from Winnipeg, and many felt that he would likely sign a long-term contract, and negotiations really just haven't gone all that well to lead to that. So Jacob Trouba still has kind of proven to be the same kind of guy he was with Winnipeg. So the fact that he was playing hardball in those contract negotiations and seemed to be demanding a lot more money than many people felt he had earned so far really had nothing to do with the Jets. I think this is just the way Trouba is here. Now, of course, many feel like he's looking for $7+ million on a longer-term contract. I know Larry Brooks of the New York Post kind of feels like they very well could end up with another one-year contract and then maybe sign a longer-term extension later. So they could do a one-year deal, then maybe do an 8-year extension, which could basically turn into a 9-year commitment on the young defenseman, which certainly could end up being a positive thing longer term, but there certainly is some risk involved here. That obviously Trouba, if he decides to not sign an extension before the end of the year, would become an unrestricted free agent. So obviously that could be risky for the Rangers here. I think he'd be a good fit there longer term, but I guess we will see. But Jacob Trouba and the New York Rangers, the negotiations have not gone as easy as many of us have thought here after they acquired him, and we'll see how things go. The other thing that they could do here as well is if the negotiations prove to be too difficult, they could end up trading him. I mean, I don't really think they want to do that, but there is some chatter that if they prove to be too difficult and end up demanding too much money, that is always a possibility that could end up happening. Now, sticking with the Rangers for a moment, there's still some talk around Chris Kreider. Obviously, he'd be a great fit on a lot of other contending teams as well, especially if you're looking to add that depth forward who can add some extra scoring, kind of put you over the top. There's still some question marks whether or not he's going to be extended or whether or not he's going to be traded. I really think the Rangers are in a situation here with everything they've done during this offseason and the way that the rebuild's been going, that they're going to take some major steps forward this year. And seeing as last year they went into the season with Kevin Hayes on an expiring contract and chose to wait and trade him at the deadline, I'm just not sure they're going to want to do that with Kreider this year, because I can see them possibly contending for a playoff spot, and they're not going to want to subtract from a lineup while heading into a playoff situation here. They very well could choose to use him as like their own rental type of player and maybe risk losing him next year to free agency, but I really don't think that's going to happen either. They're pretty good at managing their assets so that they don't lose players for nothing. So overall, I do think there's a decent chance Kreider could be moved, but if they decide they want him as part of the long-term plans, then they likely will come to terms on an extension before the beginning of the season, but at this point, we haven't heard any talk of negotiations on extending him at this point. Now, the New York Islanders are still looking to make some moves and might possibly move defenseman Nick Leddy like we've discussed in the past. This possibility does exist a little bit more than before, as they still would like to add to their forward group. Obviously, they were heavily involved in the Artemi Panarin bidding war, I guess we can call it, but ultimately lost out to the New York Rangers. So since they were not able to add him, they would still like to add another forward to add some additional scoring to that group here. Obviously, they had a really strong defensive team and great goaltending last year. They're hoping they can keep that up even with the loss here of Robin Lehner. But they obviously could combat that with some extra scoring should that come to be. So they're hoping to maybe trade Nick Leddy for somebody who can help out with the forward group, somebody who can be probably either a top 6 or middle 6 type of forward. They haven't really been linked to any particular players at this point. But as they get their other contracts looked after here, they still have a couple RFAs to look after, like Beauvillier, that they could very well look to make this type of move. There's still lots of teams out there looking for defensemen. I would imagine there would be a fair bit of interest around Nick Leddy, but we'll see if the Islanders actually execute on this. But Leddy is their main trade chip right now that they'd like to move in order Now jumping over to the Boston Bruins here, obviously they saw them have a credible deep run in the playoffs, going all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals, but ultimately lost to the St. Louis Blues. The Bruins are in a pretty good position here. They have a lot of their core still locked up longer term. They do have some question marks. For example, like Torrey Krug is entering the last year of his contract. They still have some RFAs like Charlie McAvoy and Brandon Carlo, and they are a little bit tight on salary cap space here. So looking at the contracts that are likely going to come from McAvoy and Carlo, they're likely going to have to shed some salary sometime this summer to be cap compliant for the new coming season here. Now, of course, they could go down the road on a couple of different options, but the main one that they'd like to shed if possible would be David Backes, who's being paid $6 million to basically be a fourth-line player when he's in the lineup, and he's not even in their lineup on a regular, consistent basis. He was oftentimes a scratch in the playoffs, and his game has dropped off quite a bit. He's had to change his style of play a little bit to try to find a way to get in the lineup, and it's not even working here on a consistent basis. But obviously trading a $6 million contract for a player who's not performing well is certainly no easy task. So as much as that would be their first preference, I'm just not sure that that's going to be able to be done without taking back a bad contract themselves, and they might be able to debate whether or not that's even worth it or not. But after their other offseason acquisitions that they made through free agency here, adding Ritchie and Lindholm, they do have an abundance of guys who can play in that bottom six, and it would make sense for one or two of those guys to be moved here as well. Obviously, we're looking around at guys like Nordstrom, Corrali, those type of players who could actually, aren't making a lot of money, but could provide some value and do provide value to the Bruins. But obviously, they have a lot of guys now in that role. Even Chris Wagner would kind of fall into that category. I know the Bruins really seem to be fond of Wagner, so I would think that Wagner would probably be a little less likely to be moved than the other two I mentioned here. They could also look to go through the back end as well. The Bruins defense could certainly possibly see a guy like maybe a John Moore be traded. Obviously, he hasn't been the greatest since he's come over on a contract from New Jersey. He was not always a regular in the lineup throughout the playoffs as well. Obviously, that contract right now is not looking the best, but he could certainly bounce back here. Might prove his worth overall. Defenseman like a Kevin Miller, who's 31 years old, battled some injuries, is not the quickest anymore. Certainly would make sense to possibly be moved. I know the John Moore contract, even though they gave him a lot of term after signing him as a free agent from New Jersey, hasn't worked out the absolute best. He was oftentimes a scratch in the playoffs. So we'll see if they decide to hang on to him. But although I'm not really sure that the Moore contract's not that terrible, but seeing as though he was often not played in the playoffs, that money could be very well better spent somewhere else. So I guess we'll see what the Bruins decide to do here. There's been a lot of talk around how they're going to go about this. The players they have left to sign, McAvoy and Carlo, they certainly need to shed some salary to be cap compliant. One other quick note just to remind you as well, because we talked a lot about the possibility of offer sheets existing. Charlie McAvoy is not eligible for an RFA offer sheet to be received here. He does not have enough time played in the NHL to be considered a full restricted free agent. He's a different group of free agent here right now needing a new contract. So another team cannot swoop in here and try to take advantage of the Bruins cap crunch and try to offer sheet McAvoy. That's not a possibility, but he likely is going to end up being paid somewhere around, I would say, $6 or $7 million. Brandon Carlo won't get quite the money that McAvoy will, but still between the two, it's going to be quite costly, and the Bruins just don't have the space to look after it without shedding out some other players here off the roster. Now, the San Jose Sharks also in a position where they like to add some players. They're looking for a top 9 forward. Obviously, they lost a little bit here through free agency with Nyquist leaving. They lost captain Joe Pavelski. Many of that because of the fact that they signed Erik Karlsson here to a mega contract extension, and is just taking up a lot of salary cap space on their blue line between Karlsson, Burns, and Vlasic here. So obviously, they'd like to add some more scoring. There is still some talk that they could possibly shed more through a couple of different methods, possibly by trading backup goaltender Aaron Dell. But I do think with $1.9 million on his contract and the fact that a lot of teams have fairly settled on their goaltending, I'm not sure that there's a big market for that right now, but is this something they certainly can explore? There's been some talk as well about maybe moving Melker Karlsson and kind of freeing up some space that way, but they would certainly like to add another top 9 forward. They still have to sign Joe Thornton, who's expressed a lot of desire to continue playing. There is a strong possibility as well they might sign Patrick Marleau, but obviously Marleau is going to have to agree to a 1-year deal. Somewhere around the league minimum, would be my guess, like maximum $1 million, but probably less. I think we could probably see Marleau on a $700K to $900K contract, 1-year deal if they go that route to actually signing him. That is all your latest rumor roundup here for today. Of course, as always, want to hear your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section, so let me know your thoughts and we'll continue the conversation. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content here. We'll keep you all up to date with all the latest news from around the NHL. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you next time.